The sound that filled the classroom wasn't laughter in any joyful sense. It was something darker, a weapon forged from collective cruelty and wielded with precision. In Mr. Borland's advanced calculus class, 32 students had become an orchestra of mockery, and their conductor stood at the front of the room with a smile that never reached his eyes. Their target was a 17-year-old girl named Maya, frozen at the blackboard, a piece of chalk trembling slightly between her fingers as she stared at the mathematical monster scrawled before her. This moment, this crystallization of humiliation and expectation, didn't materialize from nowhere. It had been building, brick by careful brick, for 3 long months. But what Mr. Borland didn't understand, what none of them could have known, was that he hadn't been constructing Maya's prison. He'd been building the stage for her coronation. Maya's arrival at Riverside Academy had been a milestone for her family. Her mother, Sarah, had worked double shifts for 2 years to earn the credentials and experience necessary for a transfer from Detroit General to Oakland County Medical Center. Their old neighborhood wasn't without its charms: the corner store where Mr. Chen knew Maya's favorite candy, the church where the choir director had recognized her perfect pitch, the library where she'd spent countless Saturday afternoons. But opportunity wore a different address, and Sarah had been determined her daughter would have every advantage she'd been denied. Riverside Academy sprawled across manicured grounds like a small college campus. Its facilities were state-of-the-art, a performing arts center with acoustics designed by the same firm that had worked on Carnegie Hall, science labs equipped with technology most universities would envy, athletic fields that hosted regional championships. The student parking lot looked like a luxury car dealership. Maya's mother dropped her off each morning in their 15-year-old Honda, and Maya had learned to time her arrival so the car was gone before too many students saw it. In Mr. Borland's classroom, hierarchy wasn't an accident, it was curriculum. At the apex sat the legacy students, those whose parents and sometimes grandparents had walked these same halls. Boys like Marcus Chen, whose father had endowed the new computer lab, always had the answers ready, their confidence inherited along with their trust funds. Girls like Chloe Whitmore took notes in color-coded perfection, their futures as secure as their present. They occupied the front rows like it was their birthright. Behind them sat the athletes, their varsity jackets a uniform that granted its own privileges. They might not always understand the mathematics, but they understood their value to the school's reputation. They sprawled in their seats with an ease that came from knowing they were wanted. And then there was Maya. The new student. The transfer. The only black face in a sea of privilege and presumption. She sat by the window in the back corner, a position that felt less like a choice and more like an assignment. Mr. Borland's discrimination wasn't crude. He never used slurs or made overtly racist comments. His weapon was more insidious, it was the architecture of low expectations dressed up as concern. It was the pause that stretched just a fraction too long when he called her name, as though he had to consciously retrieve it from some dusty file in his mind labeled, "Students who don't quite belong." The first test had been her introduction to his methodology. She'd answered every question flawlessly, her solutions elegant and efficient. When Borland handed back the exams, he'd lingered at her desk. "A perfect score," he'd announced, loud enough for the surrounding students to hear. "You must have had quite the tutor to prepare you for this level." The implication hung in the air like smoke. She couldn't possibly have achieved this alone. Someone must have given her the answers, coached her beyond her natural ability, provided artificial support for an intellect that couldn't sustain itself. The message was clear to everyone in the room: Maya's success was an anomaly, a statistical aberration that required external explanation. From that day forward, he'd called on her only for the simplest problems, basic derivatives, straightforward integrations, questions that could be answered with memorized formulas rather than genuine understanding. When complex problems stumped the class, when Marcus Chen's hand would eventually lower in defeat or Chloe would bite her lip in confusion, Maya's raised hand would go unacknowledged. Borland's eyes would slide past her as though she were invisible, seeking answers from students he deemed more appropriate. The class absorbed these lessons eagerly. Borland was the gatekeeper to college recommendations, to academic honors, to futures that required his approval. If he didn't respect Maya, why should they? The whispers started small, speculation about affirmative action, about lowered standards, about how the school was changing. The indifference curdled into something more active. Her contributions in group work were ignored. Her desk became an island. The Wednesday that changed everything started like any other. Autumn sunlight slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like snow. Borland was working through a proof on the blackboard, his chalk making sharp scratching sounds against the slate. It was a standard derivation from their textbook, nothing revolutionary, but requiring multiple steps and careful logic. But his approach was inefficient. Maya could see it immediately, the way a musician might hear a wrong note or an artist might spot incorrect perspective. He was taking unnecessary detours, adding complications where simplicity would serve better. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind, a memory so vivid she could almost smell the peppermint tea he'd always kept steeping in his study. Elegant mathematics is like poetry, Maya. Every word, every step, must earn its place. Anything else is just noise. The words left her mouth before she'd consciously decided to speak. There's a shorter path. Her voice was quiet but clear, cutting through Borland's lecture like a bell through fog. From step 4 to step 6. You're taking the long way around. If you believe that quiet strength can shake the foundations of injustice, that brilliance cannot be suppressed no matter how hard people try to dim it, hit that subscribe button right now. Join us for stories that prove genius comes from everywhere, and that truth, however delayed, always finds its voice. Because what happens next isn't just about one student and one teacher. It's about legacy, redemption, and the unstoppable force of someone who refuses to be diminished. The silence that followed Maya's words was total and immediate. It was as though someone had sucked all the oxygen from the room. A pen rolled off a desk and hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Every head turned to look at her, some in shock, some in horror, a few with the wide-eyed excitement of spectators who just realized they were about to witness something extraordinary. Mr. Borland's hand froze mid-equation. He turned from the blackboard with theatrical slowness, his face transitioning from its usual ruddy complexion to something approaching burgundy. But it was his smile that was most unsettling, wide and predatory, his eyes chips of ice behind his glasses. Is that so? The words dripped with condescension so thick it seemed to coat the air itself. Well, by all means. He gestured toward the front of the room with a flourish that was pure mockery. Come show us all this elegant solution. Let's see what we've been missing. The distance from her desk to the front of the classroom couldn't have been more than 30 feet, but it felt like miles. Maya could feel every eye tracking her movement, could hear the barely suppressed snickers from the back row where the football players sat. Mike Anderson, the linebacker who'd never scored above AC, was already grinning in anticipation of her failure. When she reached the front, Borland didn't hand her the chalk. Instead, he placed it on the ledge with exaggerated care, then took several large steps backward, crossing his arms like a rom. An emperor settling in to watch a gladiator fight. His expression was one of malicious anticipation. Then, with movements that seemed calculated for maximum psychological impact, he picked up the eraser and wiped away his own proof. Maya felt a flutter of confusion. Wasn't he going to let her demonstrate the shortcut she'd mentioned? But Borland had no intention of giving her an opportunity to succeed. He was about to ensure her failure. He began to write, and with each symbol that appeared on the board, the atmosphere in the room shifted. These weren't the standard calculus problems they'd been studying. These were nightmare equations, the kind that appeared in graduate seminars and specialized research papers. Triple integrals nested inside each other like Russian dolls. Differential operators so obscure that even Marcus Chen, the valedictorian in waiting, leaned forward with his brow furrowed in confusion. Borland was pulling from the deepest, most arcane corners of advanced mathematics, concepts that belonged in doctoral dissertations, not high school classrooms. He was constructing a mathematical fortress specifically designed to be impregnable, a problem so far beyond their curriculum that even attempting it would look like arrogance. He finished with a flourish, underlining the final equation twice, the chalk screeching like a death cry. Then he turned to face not Maya, but the class. His voice carried the weight of pronouncement. This is a problem I encountered during my master's thesis. Took myself and 3 other graduate students a full week to solve. Only then did he look at Maya, his smile widening into something cruel. But I'm sure for someone who sees elegant shortcuts everywhere, this should take what, 5 minutes? 10? The laughter erupted like a dam breaking. It started with Mike, who didn't understand a single symbol on the board but understood power dynamics perfectly. It spread through the room like wildfire, Chloe covering her mouth as her shoulders shook, other students openly laughing, their relief at not being the target mixing with GE. Nguyen amusement at what seemed like obvious hubris receiving its comeuppance. Borland laughed with them, a deep, satisfied sound. Well, he boomed over the noise. The clock is ticking. Or perhaps the scenery is more complex than you anticipated. This was his masterpiece. 3 months of subtle undermining, of carefully cultivated doubt, of positioning Maya as someone who didn't belong, all of it had been leading to this moment. This public, definitive humiliation would seal the narrative. She was out of her depth, a diversity admission who'd finally revealed her inadequacy for all to see. Maya stood motionless. The laughter seemed to warp around her, stretching and distorting until it became white noise, meaningless static. Her vision narrowed until nothing existed except the blackboard and the terrifying symbols covering it. But then something shifted. The equations began to move in her mind, rearranging themselves, revealing their hidden structure. What Borland saw as an impenetrable fortress, Maya saw as a facade, impressive at first glance, but ultimately hollow. Her grandfather had taught her to see beyond surface complexity to the underlying architecture of mathematical truth. She remembered his study, that sacred space filled with old books and the perpetual scent of peppermint. He would present her with problems that seemed impossible at first, equations that twisted and turned like labyrinths. The universe speaks in mathematics, he'd tell her, his fingers tracing elegant curves in the air. But humans add their own complications, their own noise. Your job is to listen past the noise to what the universe is actually saying. Her grandfather, Samuel Hayes, had been brilliant, genuinely, transformatively brilliant. But he'd been born in the wrong era, with the wrong skin color, in a country that had very definite ideas about who got to be a mathematical genius. His papers had been rejected from journals with dismissive brevity. His applications to tenure-track positions had been ignored. He'd spent his career teaching at a community college, pouring his genius into students who were told they weren't college material, showing them the beauty in mathematics that the ivory tower had denied him. Every evening of Maya's childhood, after her mother left for the night shift at the hospital and homework was done, her grandfather would open his worn notebooks and teach her real mathematics. Not the mechanical procedures of school math, but the deep, elegant truths that connected geometry to algebra, calculus to physics, the abstract to the concrete. He'd taught her to see patterns, to recognize when complexity was hiding simplicity, to trust her intuition about mathematical beauty. The laughter in the classroom was dying down now, replaced by an expectant silence. They were waiting for tears, for apologies, for her to admit she'd overstepped and slink back to her desk in shame. Instead, Maya stepped forward. She picked up the chalk, and with one swift, decisive motion, drew a single vertical line through the heart of Borland's final equation. The sound of chalk on board was like a sword being drawn. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. She hadn't erased his work, she'd condemned it. The problem as stated is flawed, Maya said, her voice not loud but carrying absolute clarity and certainty. It confuses a boundary condition with a constraint. The elegance isn't in solving it, it's in correcting it first. She moved to a clean section of blackboard and began to write. Not the desperate scribbling of a student under pressure, but the confident, flowing script of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She didn't just solve the problem, she deconstructed it first, identifying the precise point where Borland had made an error in his formulation. Here, she said, circling a section. This assumes the function is analytic across the entire domain, but you've specified boundary conditions that create a discontinuity. You can't apply the Cauchy-Kovalovskaya theorem under these conditions. In the front row, Marcus Chen's eyes went wide. "Oh my God," he whispered. "She's right. That's why it looked so complicated, the problem itself is broken." Maya didn't pause. She rebuilt from first principles, establishing a correct foundation and then constructing her solution with inexorable logic. She introduced a lemma, a supporting proof, that was so elegant, so powerful, that Borland took an involuntary step backward when he recognized what she was doing. Her chalk moved across the board in steady rhythm. The symbols flowed into each other with inevitable precision, each step following naturally from the last. She wasn't just patching the holes in Borland's problem, she was building something entirely new, more beautiful, and demonstrably correct. The classroom was utterly silent now except for the rhythmic tapping of chalk on board and the frantic scratching of pens as students desperately tried to copy down what they were witnessing. Even those who didn't fully understand the mathematics could sense they were watching something extraordinary. For 23 minutes, Maya wrote. She filled 2 entire blackboards with a proof that was not merely correct but revelatory. She took the ugly complexity of Borland's malicious problem and revealed it as a special case of something more general and more beautiful. When she finally set down the chalk, her fingers were coated in white dust. She turned to face the room. She didn't look at the stunned students, their mouths hanging open, their earlier mockery forgotten. She looked directly at Mr. Borland. His arms were no longer crossed in judgment. They hung limply at his sides. The color had drained from his face, leaving him ashen. All his smug certainty, all his carefully constructed superiority, had evaporated. He stared at the blackboards as though they contained a message from an alien civilization, beautiful and terrible and completely beyond his comprehension. "The elegant path," Maya said softly. Not a taunt. A simple statement of fact. The bell rang, startling everyone. For 10 full seconds, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted, not laughter now, but excited chatter, disbelief, marvel. Students crowded around the blackboards, pointing at different sections, arguing about implications, trying to photograph the work before it was erased. Marcus Chen reached Maya first. Where did you learn that? That generalized form isn't in any textbook I've seen. Did you just invent it? Maya simply shouldered her backpack and walked toward the door. As she passed Mr. Borland, she saw he was still staring at the boards, his mouth working soundlessly. The varsity jacket boys who'd laughed so cruelly earlier parted silently to let her through, their earlier mockery replaced by something that looked like fear mixed with reluctant respect. But this wasn't the end. It was the detonation. The shockwave was only beginning to spread. The email that arrived in Principal Anderson's inbox 2 days later was detailed, devastating, and copied to the district superintendent and the equity office. It contained a log, dates, times, direct quotes from Borland spanning 3 months. It included testimonials from 2 other students, a Latina girl from the year before who'd transferred out, and an Asian student who'd been told his success was just a cultural thing, rather than genuine talent. The investigation moved swiftly. Principal Anderson was horrified. He'd thought his school was progressive, inclusive, a model for the district. Dr. Patricia Chen from the equity office was thorough and relentless. She interviewed students individually, her calm demeanor making it safe to tell the truth. The pattern that emerged was damning. Borland had been engaging in a sustained campaign of bias, using his authority to marginalize students who didn't fit his narrow definition of who belonged in advanced mathematics. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Marcus Chen, driven by a mixture of guilt over his own silence and genuine intellectual excitement, had done more than just take photos of the blackboard. He'd sent them to his uncle, Dr. Robert Chen, who taught applied mathematics at MIT. Dr. Chen had stared at the images for a long time. Then he'd forwarded them to a colleague, the brilliant and notoriously eccentric Professor Arya Thorne at the University of Michigan, with a one-line message: "Have you seen this? High school student solved it on the board in 23 minutes." Professor Thorne had a reputation. She was known for her groundbreaking work in nonlinear dynamics, for her ability to see connections others missed, and for her complete intolerance of academic gatekeeping. She'd fought her own battles in a field that hadn't always welcomed women. When she saw Maya's work, she didn't hesitate. 2 days later, she appeared at Riverside Academy. She didn't bother with proper channels or appointments. She went straight to the cafeteria during lunch period, spotted Maya sitting alone with a textbook, and sat down across from her without introduction. "This transition," Thorne said without preamble, opening her laptop and pointing to a section of Maya's photographed proof. "Right here. You treated the nonlinearity not as an obstacle but as a geometric constraint. You essentially invented a coordinate transformation on the fly. Who taught you to think like this?" Maya looked up, startled. For a moment, she considered deflecting, minimizing, protecting herself the way she'd learned to do. But something in Thorne's eyes, fierce, hungry, and absolutely genuine, made her tell the truth. "My grandfather," she said quietly. "Samuel Hayes." Professor Thorne's expression changed. Her eyes widened, then filled with tears. "Samuel Hayes from Detroit? The one who presented at the Applied Dynamics Conference in 1979? Maya nodded, shocked. "You knew him?" "I was a graduate student at that conference. I was one of maybe 5 people in the room who understood what he was proposing about viscous dissipation in non-equilibrium systems. It was sublime, a decade ahead of its time." The senior professors laughed. Not because he was wrong, but because they didn't understand, and rather than admit it, they dismissed him. Thorne's voice shook with remembered anger. "I tried to find his published work afterward. There was almost nothing. They shut him out." The connection between them was immediate and electric. Thorne saw not just a brilliant student, but a legacy resurrected, a historical wrong that could finally be addressed. She became Maya's champion with the fierce protectiveness of someone fighting not just for one student, but for everyone who'd been dismissed and silenced. Within a week, Thorne had arranged for Maya to be virtually enrolled in a graduate seminar on advanced calculus. She gave Maya access to the University of Michigan's mathematical archives. And there, in a dusty filing cabinet, Maya found 3 of her grandfather's unpublished manuscripts, each with its rejection letter still paperclipped to the front. The letters were perfunctory, dismissive, "Not suitable for our journal. Lacks rigor. Would benefit from collaboration with more established researchers." Reading between the lines, Maya could see what they really meant: "We don't believe someone like you could have produced this." Her grandfather had died when she was 14, his genius unrecognized by the broader mathematical community, his contributions lost to all but a handful of people who'd had the vision to see past their prejudices. Maya's work was no longer just about solving problems. It was about redemption. The hearing for Mr. Borland was quiet and bureaucratic. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he resigned before he could be formally terminated. His teaching license was suspended. The day he cleared out his classroom, Maya was in the university library with Professor Thorne, working through problems that would have made her grandfather smile. But Maya's classroom proof had taken on a life of its own. In mathematical circles, the photographs were circulating. Thorne, with Maya's permission, wrote a paper contextualizing the classroom lemma and exploring its implications for certain classes of problems in fluid dynamics and chaos theory. It was published in the Quarterly Journal of Applied Mathematics with Maya listed as co-author, a nearly unprecedented honor for a high school student. The invitations followed, a symposium at Stanford, a workshop at Berkeley, a presentation at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. But the most significant was the National Junior Science and Engineering Symposium in Washington, D.C. Maya stood on that stage. In a simple black dress, her grandfather's watch, the only thing of his she owned, on her wrist. The title on the screen behind her read, Revisiting Constraints, a Geometric Approach to Nonlinear Barriers, inspired by the unpublished work of Samuel